Munson. By the way, she's an author of 5 books, 3 of which are over here today. If you'd like to buy 1 or 2, she'll leave an autograph for you, and I've got 2 of them, so keep that in mind. Her topic today is the power of one. You're going to find out who that one person is, find out why he's important, and why Thomas Jefferson recognized that later in life. Our speaker, Suzanne Munson, had a career in corporate and nonprofit communications before she retired. She now devotes her time to writing and research, and her 3 books generally have covered the Revolutionary period, and she's now writing 2 more. Before retiring, she served as the director of the historic Garden Week in Virginia. She holds a master's degree from Virginia Commonwealth University. She's still active, like a lot of us. She's active with many civic organizations. She volunteers with Caritas in the Healing Place. She teaches classes at several places, and she's still active in the Historic Garden Week. So, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce to you a friend of mine, by the way. She and I go back to being on the board of RCAP just several years ago in the 70s. And a fine lady, so it's my pleasure to introduce Suzanne.
Thank you, Dan. Well, Dan and I have known each other a long time, and he did kind of indicate how old we are when he said it was the early 70s or late 60s, yeah, when we served together on a board. We were just youngsters then in our late 20s. So little did I know that we would meet up decades later in a retirement home. So Dan was just a young lawyer then, and I learned that he went on to become a distinguished judge and a pillar of the community. So it's good to see old friends here and some new friends. Now, my husband Jim, who's over here, and we have our deposit in here, so you may see us at some of the social activities as we make our plans. And he's here today to support me because one of the speaker's worst nightmares is something going wrong with the slides. So he's my AV guy. But I'm always glad to speak to groups of those of us of a certain age, because we all grew up appreciating American history. And how many of you here grew up in Virginia and had Virginia history? Okay. Yeah, we all got a big dose of that. I remember the book. Remember the cover of it. And because Virginia history is American history. It all started here. First Thanksgiving, Pilgrim, way before the Pilgrims. And the Museum of History and Culture has a great tagline that I really like, and it was, "America made in Virginia." And so our friend Charlie Bryan is here, and I always quote him at the beginning of my talks because he tells a little story that I really like. And he says that back when we were in school, most of our history teachers had the same first name. Now, I know Charlie knows the answer to that. Anybody else know the answer? Coach. Okay. Yeah. So Coach Smith and Coach Jones, they didn't have PhDs in history. They majored in phys ed or sociology or something. But they did respect, my recollection is that they did respect American history. And they did honor our founding fathers for what they did for this great nation. And for them, our founding fathers weren't just old dead white men. You know, they were leaders who came along at the right time in world history, at the right place to change history for the better. So we hope there will be an awakening of these values in our schools in the future. There's some hope for that. But I've always been fascinated by the power of one. Actually, since I first started studying George Wythe, I started thinking about that. The power of one person to change history for better or worse. So we've got some examples here. On the left, we've got Hitler. Everybody knows about him. Pol Pot, some of us remember what he did back in the last century. Both left vast human devastation in their wake. Pol Pot in the late 70s was responsible for the brutal deaths of nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population, almost 2 million people. That was one man and his followers who did that. On the right, we see Gandhi and Madame Curie. I had to put a woman in here, of course. And so Gandhi, as we all know, was just a skinny little dark man in a loincloth, but he became one of the most influential leaders of the 20th century and inspired other leaders with the nonprofit method of protest. And Marie Curie's work, of course, was in radiology and helped us so much with our cancer treatments and imaging and so many other things. Now, I'm going to stop here for a minute and ask you all for your nominees for people who are changing things for the better in Virginia and maybe around here in Richmond. Any nominees? John Martin. Yes. Oh, John Marshall. Okay, yes. How about current people? Any current heroes we have? Jim, you want a mic? Do we need a mic here? Okay, well, I'll just throw out one. I think Jim Ukrop is one. He's one of my heroes. Has changed. He's really helped Richmond government, Virginia government in the background. As a background leader, and there's plenty of others. So now we will turn to the world stage and to Virginia history and honor our forgotten heroes. Now, Oscar Shumeg was the dean of the William and Mary Law School after it was reopened after the Civil War. And so in the 1920s, he was addressing the young men in the law school and about George Wythe. And he said, "The world knows little of its greatest men. Fame is a fleeting thing." And so we go on to the legacy of the great George Wythe, who did absolutely change American history for the better. So this is a resume that I think anybody could be pretty proud of. He not only signed the Declaration of Independence, but he mentored young Thomas Jefferson in the ideals, Enlightenment ideals, John Locke and other philosophers. Those ideals made their way into the Declaration of Independence. It was not a completely original document, although Jefferson was a wonderful writer, but a lot of the ideas were John Locke's and those of the other philosophers. And he also, George Wythe, helped write a precursor to the Declaration of Independence a few days before Jefferson wrote his. He was part of a committee. And then I maintain, based on some letters that George Wythe sent out, asking documentation of English atrocities, that he helped with the second part of the Declaration, which is the list of grievances against King George III. And being a really good lawyer, George Wythe wanted documentation. We're not just going to make up things about why we don't like the English. We want actual proof of what they've done. So for all those things, he's called the godfather of the Declaration of Independence. And Lewis Powell was the one who coined that term. Savior of the Constitution. Now, we have probably very little idea of how close the Constitution came to disaster in Virginia. It could have died right here on the vine. And George Wythe had a great deal to do with its passage. So in 1788, there were 170 Virginians who came to Richmond to vote to either ratify the Constitution or not. And they came from all over the place. They weren't just from Eastern Virginia. They came from what was then, what later became Kentucky, West Virginia, and other places, Eastern Shore. And they were not of all one mind by any means. And so we were, 4 of the 13 states remained to ratify. But if Virginia didn't ratify, it was just all going to be lost because we were the largest and richest and most powerful state in the Union. So without Virginia, basically the Constitution would have failed. So very powerful forces lined up to defeat the Constitution. Patrick Henry was the major force, but other prominent people were with him. And Henry was very, as we all know, he was very eloquent. I don't think he read very much, but he did talk a lot. Thomas Jefferson accused him of not reading any books. But he learned to be a great orator, and he swayed a lot of people in his day. So he argued for hours and hours and hours at a time against the Constitution. Well, he was a states' rights person, of course, and against overriding federal government, but also underlying all this was the fear that a government would outlaw slavery. And all the delegates there were slave owners, so they had a stake in that game. And tempers ran very high, and the delegates were evenly divided when they came, so it could have gone either way. So George Wythe had a position of authority at the meeting, and he kept his powder dry until the very end. He let everybody talk. And then he got up and he said how that we needed a strong Constitution, that the Articles of Confederation were weak, and they would not support a strong government such as we wanted in the future, a strong united nation. And so he was very revered at the time for his integrity, and all eyes were on him, senior statesman. So he offered a compromise, and that was if the group would pass the Constitution as it was presently written with some flaws, it could be amended for whatever they wanted to take care of, and then we would promise you a Bill of Rights after that. Extremely, extremely important addition to the Constitution. So they were promised that, and they did vote to ratify. But it was a fairly narrow vote. It was only 10 votes that made the difference. It was 89 to 79. And so that 10-vote margin was provided by those who were influenced by George Wythe. They were either his former law students at William and Mary, or they were his colleagues at William and Mary. And in my little book over there, I have their names. So there were 3 other states that followed Virginia, and one ratified with a margin of only 2 votes. 2 votes. Now we go to the next part of this summary of his resume, America's most influential teacher. Now I made that up, but I want other people to recognize that because I can probably take on any challengers for saying that. And we'll get to that in a minute. He was mentor to Jefferson, John Marshall, Henry Clay, and legions of leaders. Now, one thing that's been forgotten is that he was co-sponsor of America's first religious freedom law. Now, Thomas Jefferson, his former student, took full credit for that on his tombstone. He wanted 3 things on his tombstone. And in my Wythe biography, I trace those 3 things back to his mentorship by Wythe. So Jefferson was from an establishment family, the Randolph family. They were Church of England people. Wythe's ancestors, some of them were Quakers, and they were persecuted. And he made Jefferson aware of that. So I think he was a very strong influence behind the America's first religious freedom law. And so how did that come about? There was a 5-member committee that was formed to revise Virginia's legal code after we broke from England. And so they started meeting in 1777. And after a while, the 5-member committee became just 2 people, and they were the reformers. They were George Wythe and his former student, Jefferson. So they put together a package of bills that they thought were appropriate for Virginia going forward, including some reforms. And one of the reforms was religious freedom, another was public education, which didn't make it till another century or so. So I feel that he had a very strong influence on that. He was the first and only judge to rule slavery illegal. He was a judge of the High Chancery Court, and every week he dealt with matters of slavery, you know, who owned who, and wills, trusts, all those things. Slavery was involved in everything that we did back then. And but his ruling, he based his ruling, well, it was a complicated case, which I don't have time to go into right now. But part of the ruling was that Virginia's Declaration of Rights said that all men, or all people, are born essentially free. So that was just part of his ruling. That part got overturned by a higher court because slaves were considered property and not people. He was a prophet of the American Revolution. He was one of the first to call for separation from the mother country. And he was a leader, a very strong leader in the Continental Congress. But he worked behind the scenes. He was a modest man, so other people in the Congress probably have gotten more ink over the years. But he and his friend John Adams were the two hardest working members of the Continental Congress. They did everything they could to support George Washington and his troops, and also to work every diplomatic angle that they could, including going to Canada to try to help. So we have also, he was a friend to America's first 5 presidents. He was a friend and personal attorney to George Washington, and Washington stayed at his house. How many of you have been to the George Wythe House in Williamsburg? Beautiful house. And Washington stayed there right before the Battle of Yorktown, he and his staff, and they planned their battle strategy there. He was a friend and co-worker with John Adams. John Adams was a blustery old New Englander, and he didn't like very many Southern men. He thought they were very arrogant and shallow. But he liked George Wythe because he thought he was a man of substance. So Wythe was a mentor to the next president, Thomas Jefferson, and he was an indirect mentor to, through Jefferson's mentorship of James Madison and James Monroe. So 4 of America's first 5 presidents came from Virginia. And after that, Virginia became known as the mother of presidents. So how many American presidents have come from Virginia? 8, right. So someone said, well, if Virginia's the mother of presidents, she hasn't been pregnant in a very long time. So our last contribution was Woodrow Wilson, and that was more than 100 years ago. But there's always hope for the future. Now, another item that I could have added to this list is that George Wythe was a model for clean living. Our ancestors were a very stinky lot. Most of the people, and this included the elite people, bathed only twice a year. In the fall, get ready for winter. They'd have a little coat of grime on for winter. And then in the spring, for a spring cleaning, and June brides and all that. So that's where the saying began, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There was a pecking order for the bathtub, and the father, the male, usually got in first, and then the mother, and then the children by order of age. So they didn't know anything about germs then, and so the little baby was last. But Wythe, on the other hand, bathed daily. He had a deep well, and the water was very, very cold, especially in January. But every day, he went to that well, got a bucket out, and doused himself with cold water. He took a cold water shower. And even in January, his teeth would chatter, but and his face would get red, but he still did it. Why? Because I think he was one of the greatest classical scholars in America at the time, and I think he must have admired Roman cleanliness. And then later on, somebody said cleanliness is next to godliness, but I think that was another century. Now, Jefferson copied a lot of what he got from Wythe, but he couldn't do the whole cold shower. So all he did was just soak his feet in cold water in the morning. So this is a bust of George Wythe that's set down at the state capitol. And brief bio, he was born in Hampton, Virginia. He spent his middle years in Williamsburg as a lawyer and a college professor, and his last 2 decades here in Richmond as a Chancery Court judge. So several years ago, I thought it was time to honor this founding father who had done so much for us. And so people, and a lot of us don't know anything other than the Wythe House in Williamsburg, Wytheville, Wythe County, and all that. So that's probably pretty much all I knew. But I became interested in his life when I read an account of his death. And he has the dubious distinction of being the only signer of the Declaration of Independence to be murdered. Who knows that story? Jim, you got a mic? We have somebody who answers.
I think the answer is poisoned, is that right?
Mm-hmm. And who poisoned him?
I don't know that. Anybody want to guess?
Anybody want to guess who poisoned the man?
Somebody said his wife.
She was deceased. Maybe she would have, but I don't know.
Was it a slave?
No. He freed his slaves. The slaves liked him. Freed his slaves toward the end of his life. It was a great nephew who had been sent to live with him by his mother because he was very wayward. He was a gambler. He was a teenager. He was a gambler and probably an alcoholic by then. And he was scheduled to get a good bit of George Wythe's inheritance. But also Wythe was a very kindly man, and he had some former slaves in his will. And one day the nephew rummaged through his desk and found the will. And he found that if he outlived these former slaves, he would get their share. So one day he came around at breakfast time and put something in the morning coffee. Now the house lady saw him do that. She thought it was strange, but she didn't have any reason to question him. Anyway, the coffee killed a young man, a former slave that George Wythe was teaching. Killed him in a couple of days. It damaged the housekeeper. And then it made its way upstairs to George Wythe's bedroom where he was having his breakfast. And it took him 2 weeks to die. It was a very painful death. But he was able to write the bad boy out of his will before he died. But that's a good story. There's a lot more to the story. And all that happened at 5th and Grace Streets downtown in Richmond. His house no longer stands, but there's a plaque down there where he lived. So, America's first leadership crisis, July 4th, 1776. That's when we issued our divorce papers to our mother country. And not everybody was in favor of that, as you know. There was a lot of separation anxiety from the mother country because we had had a structure in place for generations, well, thousands of years. There was a king, and he was considered a father figure, Parliament making laws, and an English governor over here overseeing things, and that was the way it had been. So all that structure was lost when we declared our independence, and we didn't have a whole lot to fill in the gap at the time. So we had no formal government, just a loose confederation of states that was not powerful. So many asked, now what? You know, what's going to happen next? So no one knew. So there was no national constitution setting up the three branches. The state governments were a hodgepodge. And no one had been trained to operate ethically and responsibly in an educated way within a democratic republic, because we'd never had a democratic republic. It was totally new. Now, the Greeks had a democracy for a while, short while, and the Romans had a republic for a short while. But what we were coming up with in America, or what we would come up with, was new. So, but we had a problem. We didn't have many good leaders. We had a handful of good leaders. So in 1780, this is 4 years after independence, James Madison was very alarmed, and he said that America's greatest problem was a severe deficit of adequate statesmen. A deficit of adequate statesmen. Woo, that has a familiar ring. So here we see Washington at war. Now, the sharpest critic that I could find of our government at the time are the people who were left in Philadelphia in the Continental Congress at that time, 1778, when the war was going on and not going well. So I'll read you some things that Washington said about what amounted to Congress at the time, and this might have a familiar ring. He was disgusted by the people. The best people, he thought, particularly from Virginia, had left Philadelphia to go home and take care of things at home. And so, and a lot of other the early leaders had done that. So the people who were left were not supporting the war. And so they were literally fiddling around in Philadelphia. Meanwhile, Washington's troops were hungry. They were eating their horses for food. They were marching on bloody feet without good shoes or any shoes. And they were freezing in the cold for lack of blankets and coats and provisions. So the Congress was failing in its duties to support the war. So here's how George Washington described Congress to Benjamin Harrison in 1778. He said that they were more concerned about power and profit than in the common welfare of the country. Men who were supposed to lead were lazy, degenerate, and extravagant. They were more interested in speculation and in getting rich than anything else. They were engaged in petty party disputes and personal arguments and ignoring the great concerns of the nation. Has a familiar ring. So this was a really critical time when we needed excellent leaders. But unfortunately, most Americans were uneducated or very poorly educated. So here we see some of our poorly educated antecedents at the polls. And back then, it was legal to bribe people for votes. You had to roll out the rum and the ribs. George Washington, in his first attempt at office in the House of Burgesses, didn't do that, and he lost. And then he got smart, and he rolled out the rum and ribs the next time, and he was elected. So at some point along the way, I guess that got outlawed. So the question was, where are our future leaders and who will teach them? So two founding fathers stepped up to the plate at that time. One was Virginia Governor Thomas Jefferson, governor at the time, and his former law teacher, George Wythe. So Jefferson and another committee of like-minded people appointed Wythe as America's first law professor at the College of William and Mary. Tremendous breakthrough in education. And so Jefferson had come to Williamsburg as a very young man, was 17 years old, and he spent 7 years under Wythe's direct mentorship, 5 years studying law under him. So they appointed Wythe America's first college professor, and he turned his school into the first leadership training program for future statesmen. So during that time, this is only a period of 10 years, 1779 to 1789, these were the products of his training. These were his former students. So you had President Thomas Jefferson, indirect mentorship through Jefferson of Madison Monroe, 2 Supreme Court justices. The second one, Chief Justice John Marshall, and the second one was Bushrod Washington, who was George's nephew, I think. 2 U.S. Attorneys General, Speaker of the House of Representatives, Henry Clay, and many, many senators, congressmen, judges, and ambassadors. A college president and Episcopal bishop, his name was James Madison, and he was a cousin of the president by that name. So, we have Taylor Reevely, who most of you know, said that Wythe taught more American leaders than any other mortal has ever since, or ever will. No one was as equal as a force in American law. And then Oscar Shumate said, the mind of George Wythe, acting through those he taught, dominated the policies of this republic for fully 50 years. And so he died in 1806, but his influence carried on for many years after that. But so how did he teach? He taught law. He was an expert in ancient law and current law, even Islamic law. He studied ancient Islamic law, ancient Greek law, ancient Roman law, of course, English law. And so a lot of the young men who came to Williamsburg wanted just to get a degree from the great George Wythe and go home and make money. But he did inspire them to become leaders if they had that inclination, and to serve honorably, and that public service would be a noble calling. And he taught them it'd be better to cut off a hand than dip it into the public till for personal gain. And he was, apologies to any lawyers here, Dan, but he was called the only honest lawyer I ever knew. And he was admired for his unwavering integrity. Now, lawyers were not held in high regard back then when the first law school was founded. A lot of them were very, very poorly trained. Only the very wealthy could go to London for training, and they were trained in English law and not the laws, some of the laws that we needed here. So, Dan, did you know that lawyers were banned from courtrooms in Virginia at one point? No? That was in the middle of the 17th century, not too long after Jamestown. Apparently, a whole trail of shysters came over from London and preyed on the colonists. And so they were banned from the courtroom for several years until credentialing and some training was required. But it was thought that a man could be his own best counsel and not have a disreputable lawyer around. So Wythe set an ethical example, not just for lawyers, but for politicians. And at his death, his former students were virtually running the country. And we've mentioned some of his students. So in his influence, America was, the United States was relatively small then, only 13 states. And so one individual could have very big influence at that time. And so that was part of how Wythe could have all that influence. And so he was like a large stone that was thrown into a small pond. There was a great ripple effect from what he did. So those he mentored became mentors themselves. They went out and they taught their apprentices. Most lawyers were learn their trade through apprenticeship. And then another forgotten thing that I found was several of his most important, most prominent students at the time went west. They went to Kentucky. At some point, everybody was going to Kentucky to make their fortune. And so some of his former students founded Transylvania University, which we don't hear much about now, but it was the only school west of the Appalachians. And during the 19th century, that school produced just an astounding number of governors, senators, congressmen, foreign ambassadors, and other leaders, again, with George Wythe's legacy. So we ask, what if this man had never lived? Interesting questions. would Thomas Jefferson have become a leader? Now, when he came to Williamsburg, at the end of his 16th year, he did not, and according to his own writings, he did not have much direction. He didn't have any really strong mentors at that time because his father had died when he was 14. And he wrote a letter to his grandson saying that he could have gone in several different directions, that he was hanging out at the racetrack, dealing with the bookies and making bets and all that. And he was going to a lot of parties, and of course he was interested in girls. So he could have gone back and just been a Southern planter, like so many of the other people from the prominent families. But he was motivated, and he said in his letter to his grandson, what kind of person do I want to be? Who do I want to hang out with? I think I want to hang out with the men of substance and be more like them. So, would the Constitution have failed to unite the United States? That's a real good question. And I think a very prominent historian has given with credit for saving the Constitution here in Virginia. Would the practice of law have been elevated at a pivotal time in our history? I think that's pretty clear. Without a collegiate law school with a great professor, lawyers would still have been poorly trained. And would America's first religious freedom law have been written? I think George Wythe did have a great influence on that. And that's a whole different story unto itself. You can talk about that one a lot. Would scores of early leaders have lacked superior education grounded in ethics? So, after I read about his death, and in this book about his death, I also read about his life, and I said, well, why don't we know more about this man? So I retired from my job, and I said, oh, I can do what I want to now. I think I'll write his biography. So the one on the left is his biography. I threw everything I could find about the man in it. And the one on the right is a much smaller book, and that is about his career at William & Mary and how important that was to the future of our country. So, what would our founding fathers say to us today about our government, our powers as individuals to change history for the better? What would they say? Well, I think our founding fathers would ask us to pay more attention, to get more involved in the ethical foundations of our government. Now, unfortunately, since the days of our founding fathers, American politics have had a rather bumpy road, and this goes way, way back. John Adams said that one useless man is a disgrace, two are called a law firm, sorry, Dan, and three or more become a Congress. That was John Adams. Mark Twain added, suppose you were an idiot, and suppose you were a member of Congress, but I repeat myself. Twain also added, politicians in diapers must be changed often, and for the same reason. And Will Rogers claimed that America had the best Congress that money can buy. And more recently, comedian Robin Williams said that members of Congress should wear sponsor jackets like the NASCAR drivers, so you can see who owns them, and so on. But it shouldn't be this way. The American people have the power to change things. So we do have some power to change history for the better as individuals. So we close with a quote by Desmond Tutu. Do your little bit of good where you are. It's those little bits of good put together that overwhelm the world. So I'm going to throw this out now if we've got a mic. I listed 7 things that we as individuals could do to be better citizens or to be good citizens. And so just raise your hand. One's pretty easy. Vote.
I agree with that. Vote. Anybody want to add to her questions about what we could do to perhaps, I would suggest term limits.
Vote, that would be part of voting. Vote for term limits. Mm-hmm. Good luck. Any other things that we can do as individuals to support better government?
I hear some whispering. Somebody want to add to the table over there as to what they think we could do. Perhaps is her suggestion to improve the government operations.
Okay, well, let's start with voting. 1/3 of Americans of voting age stayed home in the last presidential election, and many, many fewer showed up for primary races. Now, we had a primary here in Virginia, August 4th. Less than 4% of registered voters showed up to vote for the Republican candidates. Less than 7% of registered voters showed up for vote for Democrats in the congressional races. And some of these races have national significance. You know, all eyes are on places like Virginia where the tables could turn. But who showed up for the primaries? Not many people. And even fewer get involved at the grassroots and precinct meetings. And that's really where the action starts. So what do we tell our sons and daughters? We say, don't enter politics. It's dirty business. It's not for us. I'll meet you on the golf course. So number 2 on my list was we need to encourage and support good individuals to run for office at the local, state, and national levels. And it's a tough sled. You know, you're going to have a lot of dirt thrown at you in the process. But, you know, we need more people to stand up. And so number 3, we as individuals, we can financially support the best candidates. Number 4, we can try to influence our elected officers, meet with them in person, show up at the rallies, let them know how you think. Number 5, we have the power to protest, speak truth to power. Number 6, education. Education is really where the power is. And here are some statistics that are really, really very troubling. Less than half of U.S. adults can name all 3 branches of government. Only 1 in 4 can identify even one branch. Only 1 in 4 can name a single right provided by the First Amendment. And here's the really scary part. Only about 1/2 of young adults today believe that democracy is the best form of government. Where have we failed? So obviously we need much better civics training in our schools and colleges as well as high schools. The John Marshall Center at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture is doing a wonderful job of getting civics education back into high schools in a much better way. But this is just a start. And then I listed as another thing that we can do as informed citizens and good citizens, and probably no one would think of this, but it's something that I've been watching for a long time. We really need to support our metropolitan newspapers all across the country. They're dying. And what I saw in the past 4 years, maybe with the Richmond Times-Dispatch, I saw, and Jim did too, well, everybody did who reads the paper. Sometimes the only thing standing between us and a totally corrupt government is an investigative reporter. And we have got to support newspapers that have investigative reporters. Now, how many of you have been following Samuel Parker in the Times-Dispatch? Do you follow him? Okay. He's the one who's been exposing all the corruption at City Hall. He's uncovered scandal after scandal, millions of tax dollars frittered away or corrupted. And we wouldn't have known about this. All this would have been covered up without an investigative reporter. So we need to keep our newspapers alive. There are other vehicles, there's online sources and so on, but the newspapers were what used to unite us as people. Poor people read the newspapers back in the old days when the papers were affordable. Middle class, upper class, everybody read the paper. So, in closing, Jefferson said, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, It expects what never was and never will be. And he also said that we can trust our government only if we are well informed. And finally, President John Adams wrote one of his sons this observation: public business must always be done by somebody. It will be done by somebody or another. If wise men decline it, others will not. If honest men refuse it, others will not. So our founding fathers would want us to step up to the plate and be counted. And we have power individually and collectively. And lastly, George Wythe would tell us democracy is not a spectator sport. So, time for questions.
A couple of comments. One, she has some books. Bibles here if you'd like to buy it. Secondly, she didn't mention it, but she also is a poet. Some of those books I have. Are there any questions, John? Yeah. You got a mic? I got a mic. I know about Benjamin Rush in Philadelphia, but did Wythe ever try to be an intermediary between Adams and Jefferson?
Not that I know of. He did not leave. One reason we don't know much about Wythe is he did not. I asked a historian if he would write a biography of George Wythe, and he said no, he didn't leave much of a paper trail. That's one reason we don't know a lot about him. He didn't keep his letters. He didn't have any surviving children who might have kept his letters. And one of the great tragedies was that somebody threw away his law school notes. Ah, what a tragedy. So I can't answer that. Yeah.
Should comment, we got a fellow who worked at Colonial Williamsburg a long time, very familiar with the George Wythe House. If you have any questions or comments to add, and we got, of course, Charlie back here with his hand raised.
One thing, in addition to these men, were the positions they held. Virginia is one of only 2 states that has a one-term governor. Do you think that, how would that have affected governing and going forward with only one term in our governors?
Yeah, I don't think he ever weighed in on that. I guess there might be some thought maybe we would have a 5-year term so a governor could maybe do more within that period of time. But I don't know. I kind of like the 1-year term, but you can always go back and run again, right? After another 4 years.
Yeah. Some other questions? Thank you again. Maybe she should have run for office. I see our Williamsburg resident has decided to ask a question or make a comment.
Thank you, Ms. Munson, for a very thoughtful presentation. We've learned a lot. I was taken when you mentioned that you recall your history book when you were early in school, 7th, 6th, 7th grade, about the time Virginia history was taught. There are a lot of Virginians in this room, not everybody, but I'm a Virginian, and I kind of remember my maybe 7th grade history book. Tell me, have you read a history book that goes back to the 1940s? And would you be embarrassed if you read
Probably.
it today?
Yeah, probably. I have not, no.
You know, I when I think about George Wythe being born in 1726, do I recall? So slavery in America was 100 years old by that time. And what I know about slavery and the brutal practice of it and how the founders of the Constitution and dealt with it but weren't able to get rid of it then, to our great tragedy. But it took a civil war to sort of begin to straighten it out. But it does bother me, I guess, as a Virginian, because what I know about it, I think I've learned as an adult. Maybe I did work in Williamsburg for 15 years, and our restaurants and hotels were open at that point. This back in the early, 60s. And Williamsburg was pretty out in front of the rest of the state at that point in time, thanks, I guess, to the Rockefellers. But today, there are so many people that are not ever going to forgive some of those folks. And my point, of course, as we would all say, is that, when you inherit slaves, and if they were inherited by Washington, and slavery was evident and very much in practice for 100 years before he was born.
That's right.
So there's a little bit of you like to give him a little credit there.
Yeah.
And things have come along, but it's only through education. That was the great point you were making. With did it, and so many others. But it's only through education that we can educate the rest of the country, not only about getting involved with government, but the history of where the heck we've come from. And do you have what do you say to people?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That has happened in our time. We grew up revering Thomas Jefferson, and we didn't think he had any faults, of course, but he did. And now he's just known as a slave owner who had a slave mistress that he could have mistreated. I don't think he did, but anyway. If you want to call slavery a sin, let's call it a sin. It is a sin. We're all sinners, okay? And there were many. Jefferson hated slavery. That's one thing people don't understand today. He hated it, but financially, I'd list in the book over there, the big book, several reasons why he felt that he could not let his slaves go, and he thought, if you know the history of slavery, around the early 1800s, they made it very, very hard for people to free their slaves. And if you were a freed slave, you had to leave Virginia. You had to leave your family and everything you knew. And also, you were not likely to be hired to work with white workers. You probably would be unemployed in many places. So Jefferson thought, rightly or wrongly, that he was a kindly master and that they were better off under him. Also, he died poor. His last 20 years, he was in very dire financial circumstances, and the slaves were part of his wealth, and I imagine they were collateral. Most slaves were collateral in loans. The Randolphs, they mortgaged their slaves heavily. There was a young Randolph man who went to Williamsburg and got under West's influence, and he came back to his family radical. He wanted to free their slaves immediately. And of course, they were shocked, but he said, I'm going to free my slaves in my will. And he died young. But the slaves were encumbered in debt. Slavery was everywhere. The bankers were involved in it. The lawyers were involved in it. Not just the planters, the industrialists, people who made tobacco. Yeah, it was everywhere. The wealth of Richmond was based on tobacco and all the southern states.